it's a basic rule within any form of Nordic cooperation. It has to be relatively concrete. It has to be meaningful to the citizen, and also the fact that it should give an added value when the 5 nation states do something together. It should give an added value to the fact that if they do it by themselves. So the idea is that constantly ensure that it's meaningful in the sense that the cooperation ensures more value per country than they would have achieved by doing it on their own. For instance, you see often in terms of the EU cooperation that the countries have to give information, have to give statistics in areas. Often it makes better sense for the countries to work out reports together rather than for themselves, partly because it can be used in Nordic cooperation, but also because often the platforms you have to build would make more sense to build in a larger cooperation, a larger scale cooperation than on the individual national level. Within the Nordic cooperation there is an institution called Nordic Innovation, which is situated in Oslo in Norway, and part of their work is to make analysis work about what needs do the business community see, what needs do the business life have. They have just issued a report which highlights a number of the problems that tend to arise for businesses that try to do cross-trade business in the Nordic countries. E-trade is an increasing problem, partly because you use various forms of electronic identities in the countries. Another problem you see is building standards. All the countries have relatively individual standards within the building sector. You have problems about, for instance, capital funds trying to move, etc. So the Nordic Innovation Organization highlights these things, and then we try by, for instance, having workshops for senior officials in the countries to make sure that you have partly an awareness, there's awareness about it, and then to work out practical solutions to these problems. How can the problems be solved so that you can ensure that the cross-trade border is flowing in a more and a steadier pace? And the Nordic Innovation Organization also very much focuses on the needs of small and medium-sized companies, because you can say the large corporations typically find it relatively easier to overcome the barriers and the hindrances, but it is also a part of the growth strategy, both on the EU level and the Nordic level, that small and medium-sized enterprises should have, it should be far easier for them to cross borders and to create growth in the neighboring countries and the neighboring regions. You see a number of rationales, but the globalization perspective is very important. Part of the work we do with the border barrier work is a part of the globalization initiative that the prime ministers of the Nordic countries initiated back in 2007 with the Punkaharju Declaration. Punkaharju is a town in Finland where the prime ministers meet. They meet annually twice, the Nordic prime ministers. Through the history, focus was very much, 60 years ago, the labour market. There was a common labour market in the Nordic countries before we actually had the European community, and also a passport union so you could travel freely. So free movement has always been very, very it's had a very high degree of interest within the Nordic cooperation. But today, of course, the challenges faced by globalization, the challenges faced by an aging population, are some of the things that are highlighted in the Nordic cooperation, and also how to ensure, for instance, labor market integration of people that have settled recently in the countries, how to ensure the environmental aspects of the climate challenges. These are some of the most important agendas today in the Nordic cooperation. If I look at my own field of work, namely the border barriers, then I would say the main challenges we see is within the social security area, the labor market area, the tax area, and the business community problems. The main problems we see are based on the fact that much of the legislation that we're dealing with is EU legislation, which is not necessarily always uniform. You could say, like in the United States, if you have federal legislation that, so to say, you have to implement, if you had to implement federal legislation in your own way in each state in the United States, you would find that often crossing borders can be quite difficult because you do not always see eye to eye about a definition, for instance, in a regulation, or which are some of the legal instruments you have in the EU. You have regulations, and you have which are directly binding, and you have directives that the countries have to implement themselves. And often this means that some of the legislation is a bit muddy, and this requires a very close cooperation in terms of ensuring a uniform view of the legislation that comes from the EU. This is one challenge we have. Another challenge we have is different structures in the countries in terms of how you organize the public sector, and how do you cooperate on the authority, the level of local authority, for instance. This can be quite difficult to find venues of cooperation and to ensure that there are venues of cooperation, for instance, for local government. But these are things that are usually dealt with in the regional forums that we have, and they're quite efficient, actually. I was quite amazed to see in a report we have made by a consultancy company that you actually have more free trade within the Nordic countries, despite the fact that we have actually 8 different languages, than you have, for instance, in the region between Austria and Bavaria, in Bavarian, southern Germany and Austria. Although they speak the same language, and it's fairly much, in my understanding, the same industrial structure, etc., there's actually more free trade in the Nordic countries, despite the fact that we have a vastly larger geographical area and different languages. I think it's fair to say that we have had some element, not much, but we have had quite a lot of cooperation with the Baltic area and the various organizations you have in the Baltic area. We have had some degree of cooperation with the Benelux countries, that is Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. I think it's generally agreed upon that in the future the regional organizations may play a bigger role than today, simply because the role of the nation state in Europe at least is to some extent dwindling, as regional structures also inside the nation states tend to play a bigger role. And you can say from a Nordic perspective, the important players, of course, is the Baltic area. There's Russia, which is in the Russian northwest. You have what is called the Barents region, which is very important to the Nordic countries. Norway and Finland both have common borders with Russia, so therefore Russia is a big player. And I mean, today the agenda is not, as it were, not that many years ago to avoid war, but to ensure how can we actually perhaps intertwine the economies to the extent that we can profit from each other, and we can not only live in peace, but we also be more ambitious in terms of securing much more trade across the borders, cooperation in the, for instance, Arctic area about the environment, cooperation about mining companies, cooperation about infrastructure projects, because some of the very large infrastructure projects that you make in the Arctic area have to go across borders, and it requires a very close cooperation. And then you have on the practical level things such as sea rescue missions and environmental control work about in the Arctic and Barents region. So these are very important in terms of the regional organizations you have. Then you can say on the West Nordic side, you also have the cooperation with the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Canada, where the obviously Canada and Greenland have waters between them and a number of common interests in terms of fishing policies and also the environmental politic area and the educational politics is quite important also, because more and more people from Greenland go to Canada for their education, etc. And you have the very close-knit Inuit circumpolar cooperation, which is also of great importance. An example would be if you go from the bigger regions to the smaller regions within the Nordic countries, then this region we find ourselves in, the Öresund region, is an example of a very close-knit cooperation between Denmark and Sweden. There's absolutely room for improvement, but many things have actually succeeded extremely well. A very important element of this was the fact that a bridge was built connecting the two nations some 11 years ago. The bridge was opened in the year 2000, and this, of course, also led to a need for a closer cooperation, because now the work commuting began to take place on a much larger level, and there was hopes that you could integrate the economies of these two sides of the borders to a much higher degree, and much has actually been accomplished. The commuting today is risen far beyond what was the case before the bridge, and also trade, of course, today between companies is at a far higher level, and you have the number of, which you did not have in the past, a number of local authorities have structures for cooperation, and you have a local political cooperation in the committee, where you have politicians from both Sweden and Denmark from various political levels cooperating. In Denmark, you can say you have what is called the municipalities, which is which do basically all public administration in terms of the citizens. In Sweden, you have other structures. Some of them are on the governmental level, but in terms of the local level politics, you also have the municipalities in Sweden, and then you have both in Denmark and Sweden regions that are, so to say, that usually deal with matters of health and education in some of the countries. And all these politicians meet in the Øresund Committee and try to form common strategies and address the common problems that the region faces.